Elijah Morgan's heart pounded as he emptied his life savings for a battered woman's contract at the auction, her eyes silently pleading even as the furious judge's glare burned into his back. Blood turned to ice in his veins when he finally understood why the woman flinched at every shadow. She wasn't just an indentured servant. She was a fugitive from the most dangerous man in the territory. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The dust seemed to rise with every heartbeat as Elijah Morgan stood in the unforgiving heat of Redemption Creek's auction yard. Sweat trickled down his weathered face, dampening the collar of his once white shirt as he surveyed the platform where human lives were bought and sold like cattle. He hadn't come to town for this. 5 years alone on his ranch had taught him to value solitude, to find comfort in the company of his horses and the vast emptiness of the Montana sky. But fate had other plans when his wagon wheels splintered on the outskirts of town. Next up, gentlemen, the auctioneer called, voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Item 37, female, 22 years of age, 5 years remaining on her contract of indenture, experienced with household duties, starting bid at $30. Elijah's eyes found her then. She stood with her chin raised despite the shackles at her wrists, her honey brown hair falling in tangled waves down her back. Unlike the others before her who had stared at their feet or pleaded silently with potential buyers, this woman's gaze was defiant, almost regal. But it was the bruises modeling her jaw and the poorly hidden fear in her eyes that made Elijah's hand rise of its own accord. $30, he called, surprising even himself. The crowd turned, assessing the stranger among them. Elijah wasn't known in town. His ranch lay 20 miles out, and he came in for supplies only when absolutely necessary. 35, called a voice from the back belonging to a man whose sunken cheeks and yellowed teeth suggested a life of vice rather than honest work. 40, Elijah countered, his heart hammering. What was he doing? He had no need for help at the ranch, no desire for company. 50 came another bid, this time from a well-dressed man whose black coat seemed to absorb the sunlight. Something about him made Elijah uneasy, perhaps the cold calculation in his eyes as he assessed the woman like one might examine a horse for purchase. 60, Elijah said, louder now. The bidding continued, climbing higher than expected for an indentured servant with no particularly remarkable skills advertised. At $100, most of the crowd had fallen silent. Only Elijah and the man in black remained. 120, said the man in black, a hint of irritation creeping into his voice. Elijah hesitated. It was far more than he'd intended to spend, more than he could reasonably afford. His ranch was modest, the profits from his small herd barely enough to keep him in coffee and ammunition. But something in the woman's eyes had changed when the man in black began bidding. Not fear exactly, terror. 150, Elijah said firmly, emptying his mental accounting of every penny he had saved. A hush fell over the crowd. The man in black's jaw tightened, his knuckles white where they gripped his walking stick. For a moment, Elijah thought he would counter, but instead he gave a curt nod and turned away. Sold, the auctioneer declared, sounding almost disappointed that the drama had concluded. To the gentleman in the brown hat. 20 minutes later, Elijah found himself standing in the dusty street with the woman beside him and a contract in his hand. Up close, she was smaller than she'd appeared on the platform, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder. Her dress was faded blue cotton, patched in several places but clean. Her eyes, he now saw, were the color of whiskey and sunlight. What's your name? He asked, suddenly aware of how rough his voice sounded after months of speaking to no one but himself. Charlotte, she answered, her accent suggesting Eastern education rather than frontier hardship. Charlotte Hayes. Elijah nodded, uncertain what to do next. I'm Elijah Morgan. I have a ranch about a day's ride from here. You overpaid, she said bluntly, for my contract. Her directness surprised a short laugh from him. Probably. She studied him then, really looked at him, and Elijah resisted the urge to straighten his trail-worn clothes or smooth his untrimmed beard. Why did you buy me, Mr. Morgan? She asked, her voice steady despite the vulnerability of her position. Elijah considered lying, considered crafting some story about needing help with cooking or cleaning. Instead, he found himself telling the truth. I don't rightly know, Miss Hayes. It seemed ... I thought you might be in some trouble. Something flickered across her face. Surprise, perhaps, or suspicion. Before she could respond, a commotion at the end of the street caught their attention. Two men were hammering something to the wall of the general store. A poster. Even from this distance, Elijah could make out the bold letters. Wanted. Charlotte stiffened beside him, her posture suddenly rigid with tension. Following her gaze, Elijah saw what had caused her reaction. Walking down the center of the street toward them was the man in black from the auction, now accompanied by the town sheriff. They were deep in conversation, the sheriff nodding deferentially as the man gestured emphatically. "Mr. Morgan," Charlotte said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think we should leave town now." Elijah glanced at her, then back at the approaching men. The man in black looked up then, his cold eyes finding them in the crowd. His lips curled in what might have been a smile on another face, but on his seemed more like a predator sighting prey. That man, Charlotte breathed. "Is Judge Augustus Blackwood, and he will do anything to find me." Elijah didn't ask questions. Something in her voice, a certain desperate honesty, made him trust her, despite the obvious implication that he'd just purchased the contract of a woman who was clearly running from the law. Without a word, he took her elbow and guided her toward the livery where his newly repaired wagon waited. "Keep your head down," he murmured. "Walk natural." They moved through the crowd, Elijah nodding politely to the people they passed as if they were simply a rancher and his newly acquired help. Nothing more interesting than that. He could feel Charlotte trembling beside him, though her face remained composed. At the livery, Elijah helped her onto the wagon seat before climbing up beside her, and the contract was folded and tucked inside his vest, the most expensive piece of paper he'd ever owned. As he took up the reins, he caught sight of Judge Blackwood across the street, now standing before the newly posted wanted sign, pointing at it as he spoke to the sheriff. "That's you on that poster, isn't it?" Elijah asked quietly as he flicked the reins, urging the horses forward. Charlotte didn't answer immediately, her eyes fixed on the receding figure of the judge. Only when they had passed the last building of Redemption Creek and the open country stretched before them did she speak. "Yes," she said simply, but not for the reason they claim. The wheels of the wagon kicked up dust as they traveled, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the trail. Elijah kept the horses at a steady pace, neither rushing nor dawdling, nothing that would attract attention if anyone happened to be watching their departure. "I don't know what you've done, Miss Hayes," he said after they'd ridden in silence for several miles, "and I'm not asking, but I should tell you that I'm a simple rancher. I can't protect you from the law if they come looking." Charlotte turned to study his profile, her gaze thoughtful. "Judge Blackwood is not the law, he merely wears its cloak to cover his sins." She paused, then added softly, "And I believe you already protected me back there at the auction. Why would you do that for a stranger?" Elijah considered her question as the wagon rumbled over a small wooden bridge, the creek below running slow and shallow in the late summer heat. "My father taught me that sometimes a man has to trust his gut," he finally said. "And my gut told me you needed help." "Your gut was right," she replied, her voice catching slightly, "and I'm afraid I've drawn you into something dangerous." The sun was beginning its descent toward the distant mountains, painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber. Ahead, the trail would fork, left toward the town of Silverton, right toward Elijah's isolated ranch. "Well," he said as they approached the crossroads, "I reckon Danger and I are old acquaintances." He guided the horses to the right without hesitation, committing to whatever lay ahead. As the wagon rolled forward, neither of them noticed the rider watching from a distant ridge, the brass star on his chest catching the last light of day. Dusk had settled over the Montana territory by the time Elijah's wagon crested the final hill, revealing his homestead below. The ranch wasn't much, a modest cabin with a stone chimney, a weathered barn and corrals that housed a small herd of cattle and 3 horses. But against the purple shadow of the mountains, with the last light catching on the cabin's windows, it looked almost beautiful. "Home," Elijah said simply, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for the last hour. Charlotte shifted beside him, her shackled hands still resting in her lap. Elijah had offered to remove them back on the trail, but she'd refused, saying they should wait until they were safely away from prying eyes. Now he could see her taking in the isolation of the place, both its safety and its desolation. "It's peaceful," she said, and he couldn't tell if she was disappointed or relieved. As they approached the cabin, Elijah noticed she was shivering despite the lingering warmth of the day. Shock, perhaps, or the aftermath of fear. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the small porch and set the brake. "Let's get those irons off," he said, producing a small key the auctioneer had given him along with her contract. Inside the cabin, Elijah lit a lantern and stoked the banked embers in the hearth while Charlotte stood just inside the door, rubbing her freed wrists. The cabin's interior was sparse but tidy. A table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, shelves with provisions, and a narrow bed in the corner. A ladder led to what appeared to be a sleeping loft. "You can have the bed," he said, gesturing. "I'll sleep in the loft." Her eyes widened slightly. Morgan. Elijah," he corrected. "And before you say anything else, I didn't buy your contract for ... that." He cleared his throat, uncomfortable. "I've got a ranch that needs tending, and from the looks of those hands, you're not afraid of work. That's all this is." A complicated expression crossed her face. Relief mingled with something like disappointment. "Of course," she said, straightening her shoulders. "I'll earn my keep, Morgan." "Elijah," she amended when he raised an eyebrow. He nodded, then moved to a chest near the fireplace. "I reckon you could use something to eat, and maybe some clean clothes." He pulled out a shirt and pants that would swallow her small frame. "These'll be too big, but they're clean. There's a creek about 50 yards behind the cabin if you want to wash up. I'll start supper." Charlotte accepted the clothes with murmured thanks and slipped outside. As the door closed behind her, Elijah exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair. What had he done? Brought trouble right to his doorstep, that's what. And yet watching her walk away with her head high despite everything, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. By the time Charlotte returned, her face and hands clean and her hair damp at the edges, Elijah had venison stew bubbling on the stove and cornbread baking. She looked younger in his oversized clothes, the sleeves rolled up several times, a length of rope serving as a belt. But there was nothing childlike in her expression as she took a seat at the table. "I owe you an explanation," she said, folding her hands before her. Elijah set a cup of coffee in front of her. "You don't owe me anything, I do." Her voice was firm. You risked everything for me today without knowing why. You deserve the truth. He considered arguing further, but instead settled into the chair across from her with his own coffee. All right then. Charlotte took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the mug. I was a teacher in Boston. My father was a professor at the university, and he educated me far beyond what's typical for women. After he died 2 years ago, I took a position at a school for young ladies. She paused, taking a sip of coffee, her eyes focused on some distant point. Judge Blackwood's daughter was one of my students. Agnes, brilliant girl, passionate about learning. The judge didn't approve of her academic pursuits. He wanted her focused solely on finding a suitable husband. When he discovered I'd been lending her books from my father's collection, philosophy, science, politics, he was furious. That hardly seems worth putting out wanted posters, Elijah observed. No, Charlotte agreed, her voice dropping lower. The wanted posters came after Agnes ran away. Outside, an owl called into the gathering darkness. Charlotte's fingers traced the grain of the wooden table, her face half in shadow. She had just turned 17. Her father had arranged a marriage to a business associate, a man 3 times her age with a reputation for cruelty. Agnes was desperate. She begged me to help her escape. Charlotte looked up, meeting Elijah's gaze directly. So I did. I gave her money, clothes, and arranged passage on a steamer to New York, where my aunt lives. And Blackwood blamed you, Elijah concluded. He did more than blame me. He used his position to have me arrested for kidnapping and theft. Claimed I'd stolen valuable jewelry from his household, jewelry he'd given me to convince me to bring Agnes home. Her voice turned bitter. When I refused his advances, he had me sentenced to 7 years of indenture. He made sure I was sold to his friend, a man who runs a saloon in Redemption Creek. How long were you there? Elijah asked, his jaw tight with anger. 2 months, till today. She didn't elaborate, and Elijah didn't ask. The bruisers told enough of the story, and now he's after you again. Charlotte nodded. He wants to make an example of me, but more than that, he believes I know where Agnes is. She looked down at her hands, and I do. She's safe in New York, married to a kind man who values her mind as much as her beauty. Judge Blackwood will never accept that she chose her own path. Elijah rose to check on the cornbread, needing a moment to process everything she'd told him. It explained the judge's interest in the auction, his determination to reclaim her. It also explained the danger they now faced. He'll come here, he said finally, setting the cornbread on the table. Once he discovers who bought your contract. Yes, Charlotte agreed softly. I'm sorry to bring this trouble to your door. If you want me to leave, no. Elijah cut her off firmly. The contract's legal. You belong here now, at least on paper. And Blackwood may be a judge, but this is still my land. My rules. Something in Charlotte's expression shifted, a flicker of hope appearing in her whiskey-colored eyes. You barely know me. I know enough, he said simply. Now eat. You'll need your strength. They ate in companionable silence, the stew warming them from the inside. Outside, the Montana night had fully descended, stars appearing like pinpricks in velvet. It had been years since Elijah had shared a meal with anyone, and he found the company less intrusive than he'd expected. As Charlotte helped him clear the dishes afterward, he caught her stifling a yawn. Get some rest, he said gently. Tomorrow will come soon enough. She hesitated, then nodded. Thank you, Elijah. Not just for today, but for believing me. After she'd settled into his bed, Elijah sat by the fire, her contract unfolded in his hand. In the flickering light, the elegant script detailed the terms of Charlotte's servitude. 5 more years of her life. It's reduced to legal language and a signature not her own. At the bottom, his own name was now scrawled as her master. He folded the paper and tucked it inside the family Bible his mother had pressed into his hands when he left Kentucky years ago. It was the safest place he could think of, though he doubted Judge Blackwood would respect the sanctity of either contract or scripture when he came, and he would come. Elijah had no doubts about that. He checked his rifle, cleaned and oiled it by habit, and then climbed to the loft. From the small window there, he could see for miles in the moonlight the trail they'd traveled, the distant mountains, the vast open country between. Empty now, but perhaps not for long. Below, he heard Charlotte turn in her sleep, a small sound escaping her. Protection had never been something Elijah sought to provide. He'd left too much behind to consider himself anyone's defender. But as he settled onto his bedroll, rifle within reach, he found himself making a silent promise to the woman sleeping below. Whatever came for her would have to come through him first. Dawn broke with the harsh clarity particular to Montana mornings. Charlotte woke to the sound of movement, the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to rising before the sun. For a moment, disorientation gripped her as she stared at the unfamiliar log ceiling. Then yesterday's events came rushing back. The auction block, Judge Blackwood's cold eyes, and the stranger, Elijah, who had purchased her contract for reasons she still couldn't fully comprehend. She rose quickly, smoothing the borrowed clothes and tying back her hair with a strip of fabric torn from the hem of her old dress. By the time she emerged from behind the curtain Elijah had hung the previous night for privacy, he was at the stove, frying salt pork and stirring a pot of coffee. You're up, he said, nodding toward the table where plates were already set. Wasn't sure if you'd sleep till noon after yesterday. I've never been one for idle mornings, Charlotte replied, moving to help him. What needs doing today? Elijah glanced at her, a hint of surprise crossing his weathered features. You don't waste time, do you? Time is the one thing I don't have to waste, Mr. Morgan, she said, her voice steady despite the undercurrent of fear that had been her constant companion since fleeing the judge's house. I'm aware of my position here. He turned fully to face her then, the spatula in his hand forgotten. Your position is what you make it. The contract says you work for me, but I don't hold much with treating people like property. He gestured to the cabin around them. This isn't Boston, Miss Hayes. Out here, we're all just trying to survive. Their eyes met, an unspoken assessment passing between them. Charlotte was the first to look away, moving to pour the coffee. Then I'll earn my keep, she said simply. I may not know much about ranching, but I learn quickly. A ghost of a smile touched Elijah's lips. I don't doubt that. After breakfast, Elijah showed her around the ranch, the barn with its small hayloft, the chicken coop where 6 hens clucked indignantly at their approach, the vegetable garden that had seen better days, and the corral where his small herd of cattle grazed lazily in the morning sun. Not much, he said, almost apologetically. But it's enough for one man. It's more than many have, Charlotte observed, thinking of the crowded tenements in Boston where her students' families had lived, packed together like matches in a box. How long have you been here? 5 years, Elijah replied, squinting at the distant mountains. Came out after the war, wanted open sky after seeing too many men die in ditches. Casual reference to his military service explained much about him, the watchfulness in his eyes, the economical way he moved, the rifle that was never far from reach. Charlotte had seen that same haunted look in the eyes of returning soldiers who passed through Boston after Appomattox. You were Union? She asked. His mouth tightened slightly. Confederate, 12th Kentucky Cavalry. Charlotte stiffened, surprised by his honesty. In Boston, former Confederates kept their service quiet, especially around educated Northerners. Does that change your opinion of me, Miss Hayes? There was a challenge in his voice. She considered him for a moment. I believe the war revealed both the best and worst in men on both sides. Miss Morgan, I try not to judge someone based solely on which uniform they wore. Something in his posture relaxed slightly. Fair enough. The remainder of the morning passed in work, Charlotte helping to gather egg, weed the neglected garden, and learn the basics of caring for the animal. By midday, her hands were dirty, her back ached pleasantly, and she felt more herself than she had in months. Physical labor was a welcome distraction from the constant fear of discovery. They were repairing a section of fence when Charlotte noticed Elijah suddenly grow still, his attention focused on the horizon. What is it? She asked, following his gaze. Rider coming, he said tersely, reaching for the rifle that leaned against a nearby post. Get to the house. Charlotte's heart hammered in her chest as she hurried toward the cabin, acutely aware of how exposed they were on this open land. Had Blackwood found them already? She paused at the door, unable to simply hide inside while Elijah faced whatever danger approached. Through the heat shimmer, a single rider materialized, moving at an easy trot rather than the urgent pace of a posse. As the figure drew closer, Charlotte could make out the shape of a woman on horseback. Elijah lowered his rifle slightly but didn't set it aside. It's Sarah Mackenzie, he said, his voice betraying surprise. Owns the trading post near Silver Creek. Charlotte remained on the porch as the woman rode up to the fence line. She was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked black hair braided down her back and skin deeply tanned from years under the Montana sun. She wore men's trousers beneath her riding skirt and carried a shotgun across her saddle horn with the ease of someone who knew how to use it. Morgan, she called in greeting, her eyes flickering curiously to Charlotte. Been a while since you've darkened my doorstep, Mrs. Mackenzie, Elijah nodded, propping his rifle against the fence. What brings you 20 miles out of your way? The woman dismounted with the fluid grace of a lifelong rider. Information, she said simply. Figured you might want to know there's talk in town about you. Her gaze shifted to Charlotte again, more appraising now. And your new ... help. Elijah's expression remained neutral, but Charlotte could sense his tension. Come in, he said. Coffee still hot. Inside the cabin, Sarah Mackenzie settled at the table with a cup of coffee, her shrewd eyes taking in everything, including the curtain that now separated the sleeping area and the 2 plates from breakfast. Judge Blackwood is asking questions, she said without preamble. Came into my store yesterday evening with the sheriff showing a wanted poster with a drawing that looks mighty similar to your friend here. Charlotte's hands trembled slightly as she set a plate of cornbread on the table. What's he saying? Elijah asked quietly. Sarah broke off a piece of cornbread. Claims she's a thief who stole family heirloom. Says she manipulated his daughter into running away, offering $500 for information leading to her capture. She glanced at Charlotte. That's a lot of money for a simple case of theft. It's not theft he wants me for, Charlotte said, finally finding her voice. It's revenge. Sarah studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Figured as much. Blackwood's got a reputation even out here. Not a good one, especially when it comes to women who cross him. Did you tell anyone I was here? Elijah asked. Do I look like a fool to you, Morgan? Sarah retorted. I rode out here to warn you because you've always dealt fair with me. But you should know Blackwood's hired 3 men from the Black Diamond Saloon to track her down. Professional bounty hunters. They left town this morning. The air in the cabin seemed to grow thinner. Charlotte sank into a chair. the reality of her situation crashing down around her. How long do we have? Elijah asked. Sarah shrugged. 2 days, maybe 3. They'll check every homestead between here and the territorial border. She turned to Charlotte. Whatever you did to rile that man, he's determined to find you. I helped his daughter escape a forced marriage, Charlotte said quietly, and I refused his propositions. Sarah's weathered face softened slightly. Men like that are used to owning everything they touch. She stood, adjusting her gun belt. I should head back before I'm missed. At the door, she paused, looking back at Elijah. You got enough ammunition, Morgan? Those bounty hunters aren't known for asking questions before shooting. I'll manage. Sarah nodded. There's a family of flatheads camped near Broken Ridge. If things get too hot, they might shelter you. Old Joseph still remembers how you treated his boy's broken leg last winter. After Sarah rode away, silence settled over the cabin. Charlotte stood at the window, watching until the rider disappeared into the heat haze. You should leave, she said finally, turning to face Elijah. This isn't your fight. I can go tonight, head north toward Canada. Elijah was checking his ammunition supply, his movements methodical and precise. You wouldn't make it 10 miles, he said matter-of-factly. Not with Blackwood's men searching every trail. I won't have your death on my conscience, Charlotte insisted, her voice rising slightly. You've done enough already. He looked up then, his blue eyes meeting hers directly. I made my choice when I bought your contract, Miss Hayes. I'm not in the habit of abandoning people who depend on me. You don't even know me. I know enough, he said again, just as he had the night before. I know you protected a girl who needed help at great cost to yourself. I know you've endured hardship without breaking. He returned to his task, checking the action on his rifle. And I know something about running from the past. It rarely works. Charlotte watched him, this man who had inserted himself between her and danger without hesitation. What happened to you in the war, Elijah? She asked softly. His hands stilled for a moment. Same thing that happened to thousands of others. I killed men I had no quarrel with because someone in a uniform told me to. Then I came home to find there wasn't much home left. He looked up, his expression unreadable. We've got work to do if we're going to be ready when those bounty hunters come. Outside, the sun climbed higher, casting short shadows across the yard. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily on the thermals, searching for prey. Charlotte straightened her shoulders, pushing aside fear in favor of determination. If they were to have any chance, she couldn't afford to be merely a burden to be protected. Tell me what to do, she said. The next 36 hours passed in a flurry of preparation. Elijah revealed himself to be a man who understood siege mentality, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had defended positions before. Charlotte worked alongside him, following his instructions without complaint, her academic mind quickly grasping the strategy behind each task. The reinforced windows with additional planking created firing positions that covered all approaches to the cabin, and moved supplies to the root cellar beneath the kitchen floor, a cramped space that could serve as a final refuge if needed. Elijah taught Charlotte how to load and fire his spare revolver, a Remington new model army that had seen him through the war. Aim for the center, he instructed as they stood behind the barn, a row of bottles set up on the fence. Don't try for fancy shots, just point and squeeze. Don't pull. Charlotte's first shot went wild, the recoil stronger than she'd expected, but by the 6th attempt she was hitting her target more often than not. Not enough to impress a marksman, but sufficient to make a man think twice. You're a quick study, Elijah observed, a note of respect in his voice. My father believed women's minds were just as capable as men's, she replied, carefully reloading as he'd shown her. He would have approved of this particular lesson, though my mother would have been scandalized. A ghost of a smile touched Elijah's lips. My mother was a crack shot, kept a derringer in her apron pocket, and once shot a copperhead that was sunning itself too close to where I was playing as a boy. The casual exchange of personal history was new between them, a tentative bridge forming across the circumstances that had brought them together, as they worked side by side digging a hidden cache for extra ammunition beneath the floorboards of the barn. Charlotte found herself studying Elijah when he wasn't looking. The lean strength of his arms, the careful precision of his movements, the occasional distant look that suggested he was seeing battlefields long past. Evening found them exhausted but satisfied with their preparation. They sat on the porch as twilight descended, the vast Montana sky a canvas of purples and deeps, the first stars appearing like distant lanterns. We should consider what happens if they take me, Charlotte said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. Elijah continued whittling a small piece of wood, his knife moving in smooth, controlled stroke. They won't. You can't promise that. He looked up then, his blue eyes serious in the fading light. No, I can't, but I can promise I'll do everything possible to prevent it. And if you can't, she persisted, if Judge Blackwood reclaims his property? The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable. Elijah set aside his carving. Then I'll come for you. The simple declaration hung in the air between them, not empty bravado or a hasty promise, but a statement of intent delivered with the same matter-of-fact certainty with which he approached every— Why? Charlotte asked, the question that had been burning inside her since the auction finally escaping. Why would you risk everything for someone you don't even know? Elijah was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. When he spoke, his voice was lower, touched with something she hadn't heard before. During the war, I was at Chickamauga, bloodiest 2 days I ever lived through. There was a moment we were pinned down, Union artillery tearing us apart. I got hit. He touched his side briefly. Nothing fatal, but I couldn't walk. Night fell and I figured that was it for me. Then this Union boy, couldn't have been more than 16, crawled over. Instead of finishing me off, he dragged me behind their lines to a field hospital. Charlotte listened, barely breathing. I asked him the same thing. Why risk himself for an enemy? Know what he said? Elijah's eyes met hers in the gathering darkness. He said, because today you needed help, and tomorrow it might be me. He looked away. 2 days later, he died from gangrene. Never even knew his name. Understanding dawned in Charlotte's eyes. So this is about repaying a debt. No, Elijah said firmly. It's about being the kind of man who deserves to have been saved. Later that night, as Charlotte lay on the narrow bed, Elijah having once again insisted she take it while he slept in the loft, she found herself reflecting on the man whose life had become inexplicably entangled with her own. There was a depth to him that belied his solitary existence, a complexity that couldn't be explained by simple kindness or duty. Sleep eluded her. Rising quietly, she moved to the small window, gazing out at the star-filled sky. The vastness of it was both terrifying and comforting, a reminder of how small her troubles were in the grand scheme, yet also how far she was from everything familiar. A floorboard creaked behind her. She turned to find Elijah descending the ladder from the loft, rifle in hand. Thought I heard something, he explained, moving to the door. Stay here. Before she could protest, he slipped outside, a shadow merging with shadows. Charlotte's heart hammered in her chest as she peered through the window, straining to see in the darkness. Minutes stretched endlessly until finally Elijah reappeared, his expression unreadable as he re-entered the cabin. Just a coyote, he said, setting his rifle aside. Getting bold, coming so close to the house. Relief flooded through her. I thought, ... single quotes I know. His voice was gentle, but they won't come at night. Too risky even for bounty hunters. They'll want daylight when they can see what they're up against. Charlotte nodded, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she felt in her nightdress, one of Elijah's shirts that hung to her knees. She crossed her arms over her chest but made no move to return to bed. Can't sleep? He asked, moving to stoke the banked fire. Too many thoughts, she admitted. I keep wondering about Agnes, if she's truly safe, if she ever thinks about what her freedom cost. Elijah added a small log to the embers, the firelight casting his face in warm light and deep shadow. You don't regret helping her? Never, Charlotte said firmly. She deserved a chance at a life of her own choosing. All women do, even if it meant sacrificing your own freedom. She considered this, moving to sit in one of the chairs by the fire. Freedom takes different forms, Mr. Morgan. Agnes was a prisoner in her father's house, bound by his expectations and desires. I chose my path, difficult as it's been. Elijah regarded her thoughtfully. Elijah, he corrected gently. Elijah, she echoed, the name feeling more natural on her lips than it had before. They sat in companionable silence, the fire crackling softly. Outside, an owl called into the night, answered by its mate from somewhere in the darkness. I've been thinking, Elijah said finally, about your contract. Single quotes. Charlotte tensed slightly. Despite his kindness, the reality of her situation remained. She was legally bound, her freedom contingent on his goodwill. What about it? She asked carefully. It seems to me that papers caused enough trouble. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the folded document he'd taken from the Bible. Might be better if it didn't exist anymore. Before Charlotte could comprehend his intention, he leaned forward and placed the contract in the flames. The paper curled and blackened, the official seal bubbling as the fire consumed the legal bonds that had defined her existence these past months. Why? She whispered, watching her servitude turn to ash. Elijah's eyes reflected the dancing flames. Because you don't own people, Charlotte. Not if you want to call yourself human. Something shifted between them in that moment, a barrier dissolving, leaving in its place a connection neither had anticipated. Charlotte found herself reaching for his hand, her fingers brushing his calloused palm. He didn't pull away. What happens now? She asked. Now you're free to leave whenever you choose, he replied, though something in his voice suggested he hoped she wouldn't. Once we've dealt with Blackwood and his men. The unspoken question hung between them. What would she choose? Once danger no longer forced them together. Charlotte didn't have an answer, not yet, but as she looked at this quiet, honorable man who had risked everything for a stranger, she felt something unfamiliar taking root within her heart. Thank you, she said simply, the words inadequate for what she felt. Elijah nodded once, understanding in his eyes. They remained by the fire until the contract was nothing but ashes, witnesses to the end of one chapter and perhaps, though neither dared acknowledge it, the beginning of another. Dawn was still hours away when a sound jerked Charlotte from her light sleep. Horses approaching, moving slowly, deliberately. Elijah was already at the window, rifle in hand. They're here, he said quietly. Earlier than I expected. Charlotte rose quickly, heart pounding as she reached for the clothes Elijah had given her. There was no time for fear or hesitation. How many? She asked, moving to his side. In the pale moonlight, she could make out 3 riders approaching from the east, their silhouettes dark against the starlit horizon. They moved with the confidence of men who believed their prey was unaware of their coming. 3. Elijah confirmed, his voice steady. Just like Miss, Mackenzie said. He turned to Charlotte, his expression grave. Stay low. Remember what I taught you, and if I tell you to run for the root cellar, you do it without arguing. Understand? She nodded, Accepting the revolver he pressed into her hands. Their fingers touched briefly, a moment of connection before the storm. They won't take you back to him, Elijah promised. Not while I'm breathing. Charlotte looked into his eyes, seeing determination and something deeper that gave her courage. Then we'd better make sure you keep breathing, she replied with a fierceness that surprised them both. The bounty hunters approached with the practiced caution of men who had done this work before. They split up at the edge of the property, one circling toward the barn while the others flanked the cabin from opposite sides. In the pale pre-dawn light, Charlotte could make out their features. Hard men with weathered faces, guns drawn and ready. They're trying to surround us, Elijah whispered, positioning himself by the window with the clearest view of the yard. When I give the signal, fire 2 shots through the south window. Don't aim at anyone, just make noise, create confusion. Charlotte nodded, her hand steady despite the fear coursing through her. The weight of the Remington was both foreign and reassuring as she crouched by the designated window, a small gap in the planking providing a limited view outside. Elijah's voice carried clearly into the yard, startling the approaching men. That's far enough, gentlemen. This is private property. The lead bounty hunter, a tall man with a pockmarked face and a cavalry hat, paused, his gun trained on the cabin. We're not looking for trouble, mister. Just the woman. We know she's in there. There's no woman here, Elijah replied calmly. Just me and my rifle, which is currently aimed at your chest. The bounty hunter's laugh was cold. Judge Blackwood's offering $500 for the Boston school teacher. All we want is what's his by rights. Hand her over and we'll be on our way. She doesn't belong to Blackwood or anyone else, Elijah called back, his voice hardening. I suggest you gentlemen turn around and forget you ever came this way. The second man, shorter, with a red bandana around his neck, had edged closer to the side of the cabin. You willing to die for a fugitive, friend? Because that's what she is. Got the papers right here. He pulled a folded document from his vest pocket, waving it. Legal authorization to return her to her rightful owner. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. Even with the contract burned, Blackwood's influence reached across the territory through the corrupt machinery of the law. Now, Elijah hissed. Charlotte fired twice through the narrow opening, the shots cracking in the morning air. The bounty hunters ducked instinctively, momentarily disoriented by gunfire from an unexpected direction. In that instant, Elijah fired once from his position, a precise shot that struck the rifle from the lead bounty hunter's hands, sending it spinning into the dirt. That was a warning, Elijah called out. The next one goes through someone's heart. I was Confederate sharpshooter, and I promise you I don't miss when I'm aiming to kill. The bounty hunters exchanged glances, reassessing the situation. They had clearly expected to find a solitary woman, perhaps with an unprepared rancher they could easily intimidate. Instead, they faced organized resistance from someone who knew how to fight. You're making a mistake, the lead hunter shouted, nursing his hand where the rifle had been torn away. Judge Blackwood doesn't forget those who cross him. This isn't worth your life. That's where you're wrong, Elijah replied evenly. Some things are exactly worth a life. Now drop your weapons and back away. For a tense moment, Charlotte thought they would rush the cabin. The third bounty hunter, a heavy-set man with a beard that covered most of his face, had his hand on a shotgun still holstered at his side. A single blast from that weapon could tear through the cabin wall. Then, unexpectedly, a shot rang out from the ridge behind the property, a high, sharp crack that sent dirt spraying near the feet of the bearded man. All heads turned toward the source of the gunfire. Sarah Mackenzie sat astride her horse on the ridgeline, rifle raised, the barrel still smoking. Next one goes higher, she called. Much higher. The bounty hunters, now outnumbered and outflanked, slowly raised their hands. The lead hunter spat into the dirt, his face contorted with fury. You just made some powerful enemies, he snarled. Wouldn't be the first time, Elijah responded, stepping onto the porch, his rifle trained steadily on the men. Charlotte, bring me that rope from behind the stove. She moved quickly, retrieving the coil of rope while maintaining her grip on the revolver. As she stepped outside, she felt exposed, vulnerable, yet somehow powerful. The bounty hunters stared at her with undisguised hatred, recognizing their quarry. Tie them, Elijah instructed, hands behind their backs. The men submitted grudgingly to being bound, while Sarah Mackenzie maintained her position on the ridge, her rifle ensuring their cooperation. Charlotte worked methodically, securing each man with knots her father had taught her during summers spent sailing off the Massachusetts coast. When she reached the lead hunter, he leaned close. His voice a venomous whisper meant only for her ears. Judge Blackwood said to tell you he still has letters from Agnes. If he doesn't get you back, those letters go to her new husband with details about what really happened the night before she left. Charlotte's hands faltered momentarily, a chill spreading through her body. The implication was clear. Blackwood would destroy Agnes's new life with lies if he couldn't reclaim his leverage over Charlotte. Is that true? Elijah asked quietly from behind her, having overheard despite the hunter's attempt at secrecy. Charlotte finished the knot with a vicious tug. No, she said firmly, meeting the bounty hunter's eyes. There are no letters because nothing happened. It's just another of Blackwood's lies. The hunter smirked. You sure about that, school teacher? Seems like an awful specific threat if there's nothing to it. Enough, Elijah cut in, his voice hard. You've delivered your message. Now you'll deliver one for me. He stepped closer, towering over the kneeling man. Tell Blackwood that Charlotte Hayes is under my protection. If he wants her, he'll have to come himself. and bring more men than you three. By now, Sarah had ridden down from the ridge to join them in the yard, her weathered face grim as she surveyed the captured bounty hunters. "What's the plan, Morgan?" she asked, dismounting smoothly despite her years. "Can't just shoot them, much as they might deserve it. We'll take their horses, weapons, and boots," Elijah decided. "Let them walk back to town. Should give us a few days head start." "Head start to where?" Charlotte asked, the realization dawning that they couldn't simply remain at the ranch waiting for Blackwood's next move. Elijah's eyes met hers. "Somewhere he won't think to look." An hour later, the bounty hunters were trudging barefoot down the trail toward town, cursing with every step on the rocky ground. Sarah Mackenzie had departed after extracting a promise from Elijah that he would bring Charlotte to her trading post by nightfall. Inside the cabin, Charlotte packed what few possessions she had acquired while Elijah prepared supplies for their journey. "You don't have to leave your home," she said, watching as he carefully wrapped ammunition in oilcloth. "I could go with Mrs. Mackenzie, try to make it to Canada." Elijah continued his methodical packing. "Blackwood won't stop. Men like him can't abide being defied, especially by a woman. He'll send more hunters or come himself." "All the more reason you shouldn't be involved," Charlotte insisted. "I've brought you nothing but trouble." At this, Elijah paused, turning to face her. "Is that what you think?" The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "What else would you call it? Your home is in danger. Your life is threatened, all because of me. I call it purpose," he said simply. "Something I haven't had since the war ended." He stepped closer, his voice dropping lower. "I've existed on this land for 5 years, Charlotte. Just existed. Since you arrived, I've remembered what it means to fight for something worthwhile." The raw honesty in his words struck her deeply. She had spent so long viewing herself as a burden, a problem to be solved, that she had failed to consider she might be something else entirely to this solitary man. "What about your ranch?" she asked softly. "Land's just land," he replied with a shrug, though she sensed the nonchalance was partially forced. "Can always find more somewhere else." Charlotte studied his face, seeing beneath the stoic exterior to the sacrifice he was making. "Where will we go?" "West," Elijah said, returning to his packing. "Into the mountains first, where we'll be hard to track, then maybe Oregon territory. I hear they're more progressive about women's rights out there." He glanced at her. "You could teach again." The thought of resuming her profession, of building a new life far from Blackwood's reach, kindled hope where there had been none. Yet leaving meant Elijah would abandon everything he had built here. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, echoing the question that had haunted her since the auction block. This time his answer was different. Moving to stand before her, Elijah gently took her hands in his. Calloused palms enveloped her smaller ones, warm and steady. "Because in a world that makes little sense to me anymore, helping you is the one thing that does," he said, his voice rough with emotion he rarely displayed. "I don't expect anything in return, Charlotte, but I won't abandon you to a monster like Blackwood." Something shifted between, a current of feeling neither had anticipated. Without conscious thought, Charlotte rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his, a gentle kiss that conveyed what words could not. His momentary surprise gave way to response, his arms encircling her waist as he drew her closer. When they parted, both slightly breathless, Charlotte saw a new light in Elijah's eyes, hope mingled with determination, and something deeper that neither was ready to name. "We should finish packing," he said softly, though he made no move to step away. "Long ride ahead." Charlotte nodded, her hand still resting against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, no longer bound by a contract or obligation, but by something far more powerful and freely given. Twilight painted the mountains in shades of violet and gold as Elijah and Charlotte approached Sarah Mackenzie's trading post. They had ridden hard all day, taking meandering paths through ravines and creek beds to obscure their trail. Charlotte's body ached from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle, but she made no complaint. The pain was a small price for freedom. The trading post was a sturdy log structure nestled in a small valley, smoke rising lazily from its stone chimney. A few horses were hitched outside, suggesting other travelers had sought shelter for the night. Elijah reined in his mount at the edge of the clearing, studying the scene with the careful assessment of a man who had learned to trust nothing at face value. "Wait here," he instructed, handing Charlotte his spare rifle. "If anything seems wrong, ride for the ridge and don't look back." She accepted the weapon, concern tightening her throat. "Be careful." The simple phrase carried more weight than either acknowledged. In the short time they had known each other, something profound had taken root between them, a connection forged in danger and strengthened by mutual respect. Elijah approached the trading post cautiously, hand near his holstered revolver. He was halfway to the door when it swung open, revealing Sarah Mackenzie's solid figure silhouetted against the warm light inside. "About time you showed up," she called. "Was beginning to think those bounty hunters found you after all." Elijah relaxed slightly, signaling to Charlotte that it was safe to approach. As she rode forward, Sarah's shrewd eyes took in their dust-covered appearance, and the tension evident in both their postures. "You look like you could use a hot meal and a safe place to rest," she observed, stepping aside to let them enter. "Come in. No one here will trouble you tonight." Inside, the trading post was larger than it appeared from outside, a combination store, tavern, and way station for travelers. A few rough-looking men sat at a table in the corner, deep in conversation over whiskey. They glanced up briefly as the newcomers entered, then returned to their discussion. "Friends of yours?" Elijah asked quietly. "Trappers," Sarah replied, leading them to a small table near the back, heading north for the season. "They care more about beaver pelts than fugitives." As they settled at the table, a young native woman approached with bowls of stew and thick slices of bread. Her dark eyes lingered curiously on Charlotte before she retreated to the kitchen area. "That's Naya," Sarah explained. "My husband's sister's child. She helps me run this place since Walter passed." Charlotte sipped the hearty stew gratefully, feeling warmth spread through her chilled body. "Thank you for helping us," she said. "I know it puts you at risk." Sarah's weathered face creased in a wry smile. "Been taking risks all my life, girl. Wouldn't know what to do if I started playing it safe now." She leaned forward, voice dropping lower. "Besides, any enemy of Augustus Blackwood is a friend of mine." "You know him?" Charlotte asked, surprised. "Know of him," Sarah corrected. "When my husband and I first came west 15 years ago, Blackwood was already making a name for himself, buying land cheap from desperate settlers, using his position to favor those who lined his pockets." Her expression darkened. Walter stood against him at a town meeting once. Next thing we knew, our first trading post burned to the ground. Nothing could be proven, of course. Elijah's jaw tight. "Sounds like the judge hasn't changed his methods." "Men like him rarely do," Sarah agreed. "Which is why you two need to be far from here by tomorrow. I'll have more men coming, and they won't be as easily discouraged as those 3 fools this morning." After they had eaten, Sarah showed them to a small room at the back of the trading post, a simple space with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that could serve as an escape route if needed. Charlotte stood awkwardly in the center of the room, acutely aware that for the first time since her rescue, she and Elijah would be sharing truly close quarters. Elijah seemed to sense her discomfort. "I'll sleep on the floor," he said quickly, setting his saddlebags in the corner. "You take the bed." "Don't be ridiculous," she replied, summoning the practical nature that had served her well as a teacher. "You need rest as much as I do. The bed's small, but adequate for both of us if we're careful." A hint of color touched Elijah's tanned cheeks, but he nodded. "If you're certain." "I am," she said with more confidence than she felt. "After all we've faced, sleeping arrangements seem a minor concern." Later, as Charlotte lay beside Elijah in the darkness, a respectable few inches separating their bodies, she found herself deeply aware of his presence, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth radiating from his body, the faint scent of leather and pine that seemed to cling to him. Though exhaustion pulled at her, sleep remained elusive. She whispered, "Are you awake?" "Yes," he answered, his voice low in the darkness. "Can't seem to settle." Charlotte turned on her side to face him, though she could barely make out his profile in the dim light filtering through the small window. "Keep thinking about what the bounty hunter said, about Agnes and the letters." Elijah shifted slightly. "You said it was a lie." "It was," she confirmed, "but Blackwood's threat is real. If he can't reclaim me, he'll find another way to punish me by destroying Agnes's new life with false accusations." "What kind of man uses his own daughter as a weapon?" Elijah's voice held quiet outrage. "The kind who sees people as possessions," Charlotte replied softly. "Agnes was never a daughter to him, merely an asset to be traded for business connections. When she escaped, it wasn't just disobedience, it was theft of his property." They lay in silence for a moment, the weight of Blackwood's malevolence hanging in the air between them. "We could still go north," Charlotte suggested hesitantly. "If I surrendered to Blackwood, Agnes would be safe, and you could." "No." Elijah's response was immediate and firm. His hand found hers in the darkness, fingers intertwining. "There's another way. We just haven't found it yet." The simple touch grounded her, his calloused palm warm against hers. "How can you be so certain?" "Because I've seen good prevail against worse odds," he replied. "During the war, I watched men with nothing left still fight for what they believed was right. Sometimes they even won." "And when they didn't?" she asked. His thumb traced gentle circles on her wrist. "Then at least they died knowing they hadn't surrendered their humanity." He paused. "This is about Charlotte. Not just your freedom, but what's right." She moved closer, drawn by the quiet conviction in his voice, until her head rested against his shoulder. Elijah's arm encircled her, tentative at first, then more securely as she settled against him. "In Boston," she murmured, "I taught my students that character is revealed in our choices, that we must stand for what is right even when it's difficult." A small laugh escaped her. "I never imagined how difficult it could truly be. Teaching is easier than doing," Elijah agreed, his voice a rumble she could feel through his chest. "But you've lived by your principles." "Not many can say the same." In the comfort of his embrace, exhaustion finally claimed her. Charlotte drifted into sleep with the steady beat of Elijah's heart beneath her ear, a lullaby of sorts, promising protection and perhaps something more. Dawn arrived with urgent knocking at their door. Charlotte woke with a start, momentarily disoriented to find herself curled against Elijah, his arms still around her waist. He was already alert, reaching for his revolver with his free hand. "Morgan," Sarah's voice called softly. "You need to get moving." They dressed quickly, gathering their few possessions in silence born of shared purpose rather than awkwardness. When they emerged, Sarah was waiting with Naya, both women's expressions grim. "Ryder came through an hour ago," Sarah explained, handing them a sack of provisions. "Judge Blackwood himself has arrived in Redemption Creek. He's gathered a posse, 12 men, including the sheriff and 2 soldiers from Fort Benton." Charlotte's blood ran cold. "Soldiers? How could he involve the military?" "He's claiming you stole government documents before fleeing Boston," Sarah replied. "It's a lie, of course, but it gives him the authority to use military resources." Elijah's expression hardened. "He's desperate." "That's good." Desperate men make mistakes. They also become more dangerous, Sarah countered. Naya will guide you through the mountain passes. There's a trail the army doesn't know about, old trading route used by her people. Charlotte turned to the young woman who stood silently with her arms folded. Why would you help us? Naya's dark eyes met Charlotte's directly. The judge's men killed my brother last spring, said he was stealing horses. Her voice was soft but steady. He wasn't. They wanted the land where our family camped. She lifted her chin slightly. I help you. I heard him. That's enough. Outside, the first light of day was breaking over the eastern ridges. Sarah handed Elijah a folded piece of paper. Mapped to a cabin near the Oregon border, she explained. Friend of Walter's lives there, Jeremiah Porter. Tell him Sarah sent you and he'll help you cross safely. Charlotte embraced the older woman impulsively. Can't thank you enough. Sarah patted her back awkwardly. Just live free, girl. That's thanks enough. She stepped back, addressing both of them now. And when you're settled somewhere safe, write to me. Would do my old heart good to know this risk was worth taking. As they mounted their horses, following Naya toward a narrow trail that disappeared into the dense forest at the base of the mountains, Charlotte looked back at the trading post. Sarah stood in the doorway, a solitary figure framed by the morning light. One more unexpected ally in a journey that had begun on an auction block and now led toward an uncertain future. The mountain trail narrowed to little more than a game path as they climbed higher into the rugged terrain. Naya led with the quiet confidence of someone navigating familiar territory, occasionally stopping to point out landmarks or signs that would have been invisible to untrained eyes. 3 days into their journey, the late summer air grew thinner and cooler, the dense pine forests giving way to rocky outcroppings that offered sweeping views of the valleys below. We cross ridge before nightfall, Naya said during one of their brief rests, her English precise despite its occasional awkwardness. Tomorrow, safer path through old hunting grounds. Charlotte leaned against a sun-warmed boulder, stretching her aching legs. The journey had been punishing. Long hours in the saddle, followed by cold camps where they dared not risk more than the smallest of fires. Yet despite the physical hardship, she found herself drawing strength from the vastness of the landscape. So different from the crowded streets of Boston where she had spent most of her life. Your people lived in these mountains? She asked Naya, accepting a water skin from Elijah with a grateful smile. The young woman nodded, her expression softening slightly. Many seasons. Before soldiers came with papers saying mountains not ours anymore. She gestured toward a distant peak. My grandfather's father buried there. Sacred place. Her voice held no self-pity, only a matter-of-fact acceptance that stirred something in Charlotte's heart. I'm sorry, Charlotte said softly. It seems we both know what it means to have men with papers decide our fate. Naya studied her for a moment, then offered a rare smile. Difference is, fight back. She glanced at Elijah, who was checking their horses' shoes for signs of wear. Both of you. As they prepared to continue, Elijah moved closer to Charlotte, his voice low. How are you holding up? I'm fine, she assured him, though her body protested every movement. Better than I expected, actually. His eyes searched her face, seeing beyond the brave front she maintained. You're stronger than you realize, Charlotte Hayes. The simple observation, delivered with quiet certainty, warmed her more than any campfire could have. Over the past days, their connection had deepened through shared danger and small intimacies, hands touching while passing supplies, shoulders pressed together for warmth during cold nights, conversations whispered in the darkness that revealed more of themselves than either had shared with another person in years. By late afternoon, they had reached the ridge Naya had indicated. Below them, the landscape unfurled in a breathtaking panorama, forested valleys giving way to open plains that stretched toward the distant horizon. Beautiful, Charlotte breathed, momentarily forgetting the danger that drove them forward. And dangerous, Naya cautioned, pointing to a thin line of dust barely visible in the valley below. Riders, moving fast. Elijah produced a small brass spyglass from his saddlebag, extending it to study the distant figure. His expression darkened as he lowered the glass. 6 men, he reported grimly, moving along the main trail. He handed the spyglass to Charlotte, who raised it with trembling hands. Even at this distance, she recognized the distinctive black coat of Judge Blackwood, riding at the head of the group. A wave of nausea washed over her as memories of his cold eyes and proprietary touch threatened to overwhelm her. He's split his forces, Elijah observed. Smart. The others are probably covering the northern passes. How did they find trails so quickly? Naya wondered aloud, her usual composure slipping to reveal concern. Blackwood knows these territories better than we realized, Elijah replied. Or he's found someone who does. They retreated from the ridgeline, following Naya to a sheltered hollow where they could discuss their options without risk of being spotted from below. They'll reach the valley crossroads by nightfall, Elijah said, unfolding Sarah's crude map on a flat stone. If they continue east, we should be safe. If they turn north, they'll intercept us at the pass tomorrow. Charlotte finished, the reality of their situation settling like a stone in her stomach. Naya studied the map, her finger tracing an alternative route. There's another way, harder. Not for horses. She indicated a nearly vertical section of the mountain. Old hunting trail. Very steep, but it leads to cave system. We can hide. Let them pass. Elijah considered this, his eyes meeting Charlotte's. The unspoken question passed between them. Could she endure such a difficult path? I can do it, she said firmly. answering his unasked concern. Whatever it takes. The decision made, they continued along the ridge until dusk, when Naya led them to a small plateau sheltered by overhanging rock. Here, hidden from both the valley below and the sky above, they made camp for the night. No fire was possible, the risk of detection too great, so they huddled together for warmth as the mountain temperature plummeted with nightfall. "Tell me about Boston," Elijah said quietly as they shared a meager supper of hard bread and dried meat. "What do you miss most?" Charlotte considered the question, grateful for the distraction from their precarious situation. "The libraries," she answered finally. "Rooms filled with books from floor to ceiling. History, philosophy, literature from around the world. My father would take me every Saturday when I was a girl." "You had an unusual upbringing for a woman," he observed. "My father believed education should know no gender," she replied, smiling at the memory. "He used to say the mind is the one true territory where freedom cannot be restricted unless we surrender it voluntarily." The irony of her current situation, physically fleeing across territory to preserve her freedom, was not lost on her. "Wise man," Elijah commented. "I'd have liked to meet him." "He would have liked you," Charlotte said with certainty. "He respected people who acted on their principles." She hesitated, then added softly, "As do I." Their eyes met in the darkness, a current of feeling passing between them that transcended their dire circumstances. Charlotte found herself wondering what might have been possible for them in another life, one where they had met as equal, unbound by contracts or pursuit. "Get sleep," Naya interrupted from her position at the edge of their small camp where she kept watch. "Tomorrow, hardest part of journey," Charlotte nodded, settling against Elijah's side with the easy familiarity that had developed between them. His arm encircled her shoulders, drawing her closer against the mountain chill. "Elijah," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "If something happens tomorrow, if we're separated, ... single quote." She couldn't finish the thought. The possibility, it's painful to articulate. His hand found hers in the darkness, fingers interlacing. "Nothing will happen," he promised, though they both knew it was a vow he might not be able to keep. "But if it does," she persisted, "I want you to know that the words caught in her throat, emotions she had barely acknowledged to herself, threatening to spill over. Elijah turned toward her, his face inches from hers in the starlight filtering through the overhanging rock. "I know," he said simply. "I feel it too." When his lips found hers, it was not the tentative kiss they had shared at the ranch, but something deeper, a communion of souls who had found each other against impossible odds. Charlotte leaned into him, her hands moving to frame his face, memorizing the contours of his features by touch. They parted reluctantly, foreheads still touching, breath mingling in the cold night air. No further words were needed. Whatever lay ahead, this moment was theirs, a truth that transcended the danger surrounding them. Dawn arrived with a shroud of mist clinging to the mountainside, obscuring the valley below. They broke camp quickly, securing the horses in a sheltered meadow with enough grass and water to sustain them for several days. Quote, "We don't return ... single quotes," Elijah began, patting his faithful mount's neck. "Someone will find them," Naya assured him pragmatically. Good horses not stay alone long in these mountains. The climb that followed tested Charlotte's endurance beyond anything she had previously experienced. The path, if it could be called such, was often little more than slight indentations in near vertical rock faces, requiring them to use hands as well as feet. Naya moved with the agility of a mountain goat, occasionally extending a hand to help Charlotte over particularly difficult sections. Elijah remained close behind her, his presence a silent reassurance. Once, when her foot slipped on loose shale, his hand shot out instantly to steady her, strong fingers gripping her arm until she regained her footing. "Thank you," she breathed, heart pounding from the near fall. His eyes held hers for a moment, intense with an emotion that needed no name. "Always," he replied simply. By midday, they had reached a narrow ledge that curved around the mountain face. Naya held up a hand, signaling them to stop and remain silent. Pressing themselves against the rock wall, they listened. From somewhere below came the distant sound of voices and the distinctive clink of metal, bridles or weapons catching sunlight. "They've found the trail," Elijah whispered, his expression grim. Naya nodded. "We must move faster. Cave entrance close." They continued along the ledge, moving as quickly as caution allowed. Charlotte's muscles burned with exertion, her hands raw from gripping rough stone. But beneath the physical discomfort burned a fierce determination. She would not become Blackwood's property again, would not surrender the freedom she had tasted, or the chance at a future with the man beside her. The ledge widened slightly as it curved around an outcropping, revealing a dark crevice in the rock face partially hidden by stunted pine tree. "There," Naya whispered triumphantly, "cave entrance." As they approached the narrow opening, a shot rang out, the report echoing across the mountainside. Instinctively, they flattened themselves against the rock wall, hearts pounding. "They've spotted us," Elijah said, reaching for the revolver at his hip. But Naya shook her head, pointing downward. Below them, perhaps half a mile distant, Blackwood's men had encountered another group on the trail. Not fugitives, but a small band of native hunters returning from the high country. Even from this distance, the confrontation was clearly hostile. Charlotte watched in horror as the confrontation unfolded below. Through the thin mountain air, fragments of angry voices carried upward, demands for information, denials, threats. Judge Blackwood sat on his horse slightly apart from his men, his posture rigid with authority as the sheriff gestured aggressively at the native hunters. "They're asking about us," Naya whispered, her expression darkening. "Want to know if anyone's seen strangers on mountain?" Another shot cracked through the air, a warning fired into the ground near the hunter's feet. The leader of the small band stood his ground, arms crossed, refusing to be intimidated. "We should help them," Charlotte said instinctively, distressed by the thought that others might suffer because of her. Elijah placed a restraining hand on her arm. "We can't, not without revealing ourselves and endangering everyone. But they won't harm them," Naya interjected with quiet certainty. "Too many witnesses. This just show of power." She tugged Charlotte's sleeve. "Come." While attention below, we enter cave. Reluctantly, Charlotte allowed herself to be led toward the narrow crevice. Elijah went first, scouting the opening before helping the women through. The passage was tight, requiring them to turn sideways and inch forward into the darkness. After several claustrophobic moments, the space widened suddenly into a cavern large enough to stand upright. Naya produced a small package from her deerskin pouch, unwrapping a candle stub and flint. With practiced movements, she struck a spark and lit the candle, its warm glow revealing the contours of their shelter. The cave extended deeper into the mountain, water dripping somewhere in the darkness beyond their small circle of light. "Safe here," Naya declared, setting the candle in a natural niche in the stone wall. "No one find entrance unless they know where to look." Charlotte sank onto a flat rock, the tension of their climb and the distress of witnessing the confrontation below catching up with her. Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted the water skin Elijah offered. "Those men," she said after drinking deeply, "will they be all right?" Naya nodded. "My cousin leads hunting party. He is a respected warrior, knows how to handle white officials." Her tone conveyed pride mixed with practicality. "They give false information. Send Blackwood's men wrong direction." Elijah had moved to the cave entrance, positioning himself where he could observe without being seen. "They're moving on," he reported after a few minutes, "heading northeast away from our actual trail." Relief washed over Charlotte, though it was tempered by the knowledge that their reprieve was likely temporary. "How long should we stay here?" "Until nightfall," Naya advised, settling cross-legged on the cave floor. "Then continue through cave system. Comes out 3 miles west, near old trapping grounds." As the hours passed in the dim cave, Charlotte found herself studying Elijah's profile as he maintained his vigil at the entrance. The past week had transformed her perception of him from the stranger who had inexplicably purchased her contract to the man who now risked everything to ensure her freedom. Beyond his weathered exterior lay depths she was only beginning to understand, passion tempered by pragmatism, strength balanced with gentleness, and a moral compass that had led him to sacrifice his home and safety for her. "What will you do?" she asked softly, moving to sit beside him. "If we make it to Oregon?" He glanced at her, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "When we make it to Oregon," he corrected gently, "and I don't know. Never thought much beyond the next season on the ranch." He paused, considering. "Maybe find land near water this time. Build something new. Alone?" The question escaped before Charlotte could reconsider its implications. Elijah turned to face her fully, blue eyes serious in the fading daylight that filtered through the crevice. "That depends," he said quietly. "On what?" "On whether a Boston-educated schoolteacher might consider a life with an ex-Confederate rancher who has little to offer but his hands and his heart." The directness of his words stole her breath. In proper Boston society, such a declaration would have come after months of formal courtship, perhaps delivered in a carefully worded letter to her father. But here, in a mountain cave with danger at their heels, the conventional rules that had governed Charlotte's life seemed as distant as the city she had left behind. "I think," she replied carefully, her heart racing, "that such a schoolteacher might consider that the truest wealth lies not in possessions but in finding someone who values freedom and honor as she does." She reached for his hand, her fingers entwining with his. "Someone who sees her as a person to cherish rather than a possession to control." The smile that transformed Elijah's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He raised their joined hands, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. "First," he said pragmatically, though his voice was rough with emotion, "we need to reach Oregon alive." From her position deeper in the cave, Naya observed their exchange with knowing eyes. "Night comes," she announced, rising gracefully to her feet. "Time to continue journey." The cave system proved to be an extensive network of tunnels and chambers that wound through the heart of the mountain. Naya led them confidently, the single candle casting grotesque shadows on the stone walls. In places, the passage narrowed to such an extent that they were forced to crawl on hands and knees, the rough rock scraping their palms and tearing at their clothes. "My people used these caves for many generations," Naya explained during a brief rest in a larger chamber where multiple tunnels converged. "For ceremonies, for hiding during wars, for storage of winter food." "It's remarkable," Charlotte marveled, gazing at the stalactites that hung from the ceiling like stone icicles. "A hidden world beneath the mountains." "Many things hidden in this land," Naya replied with a small smile. "Not all white men's maps show truth." They continued deeper into the labyrinth, the air growing cooler and damper. Occasionally they passed chambers where ancient handprints marked the walls, walls or stone circles suggested long-ago fires. Charlotte felt a profound sense of transience. Her own troubles seemed momentary when viewed against the backdrop of this timeless place where countless others had sought refuge before her. After what seemed like hours of navigating the twisting passages, a faint glow appeared ahead, not the warm yellow of their candle, but the cool blue of moonlight. The tunnel sloped upward, opening into a narrow fissure that offered access to the world above. Naya extinguished their candle. "Wait," she whispered. "I check first." She slipped through the opening like a shadow, leaving Charlotte and Elijah alone in the near darkness. His hand found hers immediately, a silent reassurance in the gloom. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. "Yes," she replied, surprised to discover it was true despite their harrowing journey. "I feel different. Stronger somehow." "You've always been strong," he said. "You just needed the chance to discover it." Before she could respond, Naya reappeared at the cave entrance. "Safe," she announced. No sign of Blackwood's men. They emerged into a small clearing ringed by towering pines, the moon casting silver light across the landscape. After the confined darkness of the caves, the open sky felt almost overwhelming. Charlotte drew deep breaths of the pine-scented air, relishing the sense of freedom it brought. According to Naya, they were now on the western slope of the mountain range, well away from their pursuers' search area. A small stream gurgled nearby, providing welcome fresh water to refill their depleted supplies. "We rest here tonight," Naya decided, indicating a sheltered spot beneath an overhanging rock. "Tomorrow, follow stream to valley. 2 more days to Porter's cabin." As they prepared a cold camp, Charlotte felt a subtle shift in their dynamic. Naya, who had maintained a certain distance despite her willingness to help, seemed to have accepted them as more than fugitives she was obligated to guide. She shared stories of her childhood in these mountains, speaking of the seasonal migrations her people had followed and the lessons her grandmother had taught her about the healing properties of various plants. Later, as Naya slept nearby, Charlotte and Elijah sat close together, watching the stars wheel overhead through a gap in the trees. His arm encircled her shoulders, her head resting comfortably against him. "What was she like?" Charlotte asked softly. "Agnes, you've risked everything to help her, but you've never really described her." Charlotte considered the question, memories of her former student rising in her mind. "Curious," she said finally, always questioning, never satisfied with simple answers. She wanted to understand how the world worked, not just society's expectations for women, but everything. Science, politics, philosophy. A fond smile touched her lips. She once stayed after class for 3 hours debating the merits of John Stuart Mill's arguments for women's equality. "She sounds like someone else I know," Elijah observed, his tone warm with affection. "Perhaps," Charlotte acknowledged. "I saw something of myself in her. The same hunger for knowledge, the same frustration with arbitrary limitations." She sighed softly. "But she had a courage I lacked until recently. When she decided to claim her freedom, she never wavered." "And now?" Elijah prompted gently. Charlotte lifted her face to his, moonlight silvering her features. "Now I understand what she knew then, that some risks are worth taking, some battles worth fighting, even against overwhelming odds." His hand rose to cup her cheek, thumb tracing the delicate line of her jaw. "Charlotte Hayes," he murmured, "I believe you may be the bravest person I've ever known." When he kissed her, it felt like a promise, not just of passion, but of partnership, of a future they would forge together despite the forces aligned against them. For the first time since fleeing Boston, Charlotte allowed herself to truly hope. The journey down from the mountains proved gentler than their ascent, though not without challenges. They followed the stream as it widened into a creek, then a small river, the water carving a natural path through forest and meadow. Game was plentiful, allowing Naya to supplement their dwindling provisions with rabbit and grouse. On the evening of their second day after emerging from the caves, they made camp in a small clearing where wild berries grew in abundance. "Porter's cabin one day more," Naya announced as she expertly skinned a rabbit for their supper. "Maybe less if weather holds." Charlotte gathered berries in a small pouch fashioned from a spare shirt, her fingers stained purple with juice. The relative peace of the past 2 days had allowed her body to recover somewhat from the rigors of their mountain crossing, though exhaustion lingered in her bones. Still, there was a satisfaction in this direct engagement with survival, so different from her sheltered life in Boston, where necessities appeared as if by magic, the labor behind them invisible. "You've gone quiet," Elijah observed, approaching with an armload of firewood. In the safety of this secluded valley, they had decided a small fire was worth the risk for hot food and the comfort of warmth. "Just thinking," Charlotte replied, offering him a handful of berries. "About how different this is from everything I've known before." He accepted the fruit, their fingers brushing in a touch that still sent warmth spreading through her despite its familiarity. "Different better or different worse?" She considered the question seriously. "Different, truer, I think. In Boston, everything was arranged to hide the realities of life, the effort, the struggle, the connections between actions and consequences." She gestured to the wilderness around them. "Here, there's nowhere to hide from truth. It's harsh sometimes, but honest." Elijah's smile was gentle. "You sound like you're considering a permanent change of address, Miss Hayes." "Perhaps I am," she admitted, surprising herself with the realization that she felt more alive in these dangerous circumstances than she ever had in the safety of her former life. "Though I imagine I'd want some comforts eventually." Books, for instance. A real roof. I think that could be arranged, he replied, his tone light though his eyes held deeper meaning. Their quiet moment was interrupted by Nia's sudden tension. She rose from her work by the fire, head cocked in a listening posture that immediately put them on alert. Horses, she said simply. Coming from west. Elijah moved immediately, kicking dirt over their small fire while Charlotte gathered their essential belonging. Within moments, they had retreated to the edge of the clearing, concealed among the dense undergrowth. Nia melted into the forest on the opposite side, her knowledge of woodcraft making her nearly invisible even to her companions. The riders appeared minutes later, 3 men on trail-worn horses, moving at the unhurried pace of those who know the terrain well. They were not soldiers or obvious bounty hunters, but rather the rough-hewn frontier types common to these borderlands. Trappers, perhaps, or prospectors. They dismounted in the clearing, drawn by the remains of the hastily extinguished fire. Still warm, one observed, crouching to touch the scattered embers. Someone was here recent. The tallest of the group surveyed the clearing with practiced eyes. 3 sets of tracks, 2 larger men most likely, and 1 smaller. Woman or youth. Charlotte felt Elijah tense beside her, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. She placed her hand gently on his arm, a silent plea for patience. Could be that group Blackwood's men were asking about yesterday, the third man suggested, adjusting his worn slouch hat. Said there'd be good money for information. At this, Charlotte's heart seemed to skip a beat. Despite their precautions, Blackwood's reach extended even to this remote valley. Ain't our business, the tall man replied, to Charlotte's immense relief. We got pelts to trade and supplies to buy. You don't need trouble with whoever's running from the law, nor with the law itself. The 3 men remounted after a brief rest, continuing westward along the creek. Only when the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely did Nia emerge from her hiding place, signaling the all clear. They head to trading post, she said, frowning. Same direction as Porter's cabin. Will they cause problems? Charlotte asked anxiously. Nia considered this. Trappers my known business mostly. But if Blackwood offering money ... single quotes, she left the implication hanging. We need to change course, Elijah decided, studying the crude map Sarah had provided. Approach Porter's place from the north instead of following the creek directly. Longer journey, Nia warned. Rough country. Better rough country than another encounter, Elijah replied grimly. We've come too far to take unnecessary risks now. They abandoned the relative comfort of the creekside trail, instead heading northwest through dense forest that showed little sign of human passage. Progress slowed considerably as they navigated fallen trees, rocky outcroppings, and sections of marshy ground. By nightfall, they had covered less than half the distance they had managed the previous day. We make cold camp here, Nia declared as darkness made further travel impossible. No fire tonight. The night was noticeably cooler without the warmth of a fire. They huddled together beneath a makeshift shelter of pine boughs, sharing body heat against the mountain chill. Charlotte found herself between Elijah and Nia, grateful for their warmth and the strange sense of family that had developed among the 3 unlikely companions. Tell me about Oregon, she whispered to Elijah, seeking distraction from the discomfort of hard ground and cold air. Have you been there before? Once, he replied, his breath warm against her ear. After the war, before I settled in Montana. It's beautiful country, green forests that run all the way to the ocean, valleys so fertile you can almost watch things grow. It sounds like paradise. He chuckled softly. Not quite. Plenty of rain, especially on the coast. Winters can be hard in their own way, but the people there ... is good, considering his words. They're more focused on building something new than reliving old grievances. A man's past matters less than what he can contribute. And a woman's past? Charlotte asked. His arm tightened around her waist. The same, I'd imagine. It's frontier country still, but with settlements established enough that there are schools, churches, communities where education is valued, where I might teach again, she mused, allowing herself to envision such a future. If that's what you want, he agreed, or whatever else you might choose. The simple acknowledgement of her right to choose her own path. Something Blackwood had tried to strip from her entirely filled Charlotte with warmth that had nothing to do with physical comfort. She turned slightly, finding Elijah's face in the darkness, her fingers tracing the now familiar contours of his jawline. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For seeing me as a person with choices, not a possession with obligations. His hand covered hers, pressing her palm more firmly against his cheek. I won't ever own you, Charlotte, not by contract or marriage or any other bond. Whatever's between us has to be freely given on both sides or it's not worth having. In the darkness, her tears fell silently, not from sorrow, but from the profound recognition of having found someone who understood the true meaning of freedom and respect. When their lips met, it was a communion of equals, a promise exchanged without words, but no less binding for its silence. Morning brought low clouds and a fine, misty rain that seemed to hang suspended in the air rather than falling properly. They continued their northward detour, clothing growing increasingly sodden as the day progressed. The forest vegetation thickened, requiring them to force passage through tangled underbrush in some place. By midday, Charlotte was chilled to the bone, her wet garments clinging uncomfortably. Naya led them to a hollow beneath an ancient cedar, its massive trunk and spreading branches offering some shelter from the persistent drizzle. "Rest," she instructed, producing strips of dried meat from her pouch. "Eat." Porter's cabin still far. As they huddled in the relative dryness of their temporary shelter, a distant sound carried through the mist, a dog barking, followed by the crack of a rifle shot. All three froze, exchanging alarmed glances. "Hunters?" Charlotte whispered hope. Naya shook her head, expression grave. "Wrong season for big game. No one hunts in this weather unless necessary." "Blackwoodsmen?" Elijah asked, voice low. "Maybe," Naya admitted. "Or settlers protecting territory from strangers." The implications were clear. Either possibility presented danger. Elijah checked his weapons methodically, ensuring the dampness hadn't compromised their function. "How far to Porter's cabin from here?" he asked. Naya considered, mentally recalculating their position after the northward detour. "Half day, maybe more in this weather. And the source of those sounds?" She gestured westward. "That direction. Maybe 3 miles. Charlotte's mind raced, calculating distances and directions. That could be near Porter's cabin itself, she realized aloud. "If they've found him, asked about strangers, single quotes, the possibility hung heavily in the damp air. If Blackwood had somehow discovered their destination and reached it first, their last hope of safe passage might already be compromised. We need to know what we're walking into," Elijah decided. "Naya, can you scout ahead, see what's happening without being spotted?" The young woman nodded confidently. "I'd move quiet." "We'll see, then return." "Be careful," Charlotte urged, gripping the other woman's hand briefly. A ghost of a smile touched Naya's lips. "Always careful. You two stay here. Stay hidden." With that, she slipped away into the misty forest, her form quickly swallowed by the gray curtain of rain and fog. Left alone, Charlotte and Elijah maintained a tense silence, straining to hear any further sounds through the soft patter of raindrops on leaves. After what seemed an eternity but was likely only minutes, Elijah spoke. "If Porter's place isn't safe," he said quietly, "we'll need another plan." Charlotte nodded, mind already working through possibilities. "The Oregon border can't be far. If we could cross it, Blackwood's jurisdiction would end," Elijah. "But that doesn't mean he wouldn't follow. Men like him don't respect legal boundaries when their pride is wounded." "Then we keep going," she said with determination. "California, perhaps, or by sea to San Francisco, then east again when enough time has passed." Elijah studied her face, admiration evident in his eye. "You never consider surrendering, do you?" "Not anymore," Shard replied simply. "Too much at stake now." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining. "Whatever happens," he promised, "we face it together." Naya returned as dusk approached, materializing from the mist like a spirit. Her expression was grim, water dripping from her braided hair as she crouched beside them under the cedar's shelter. "Porter's cabin surrounded," she reported in clipped phrases. 4 men, 2 Blackwoods, 2 soldiers. Porter himself tied to chair inside. Charlotte's heart sank. Their last hope of safe passage, the friendly homestead where they might have found rest and guidance, had become a trap. "They're using him as bait," Elijah concluded, his jaw tightened, "waiting for us to walk in unsuspect." "Porter's still alive?" Charlotte asked, concerned for the man who'd never met them yet suffered for the connection to Sarah Mackenzie. Naya nodded. "Alive, but beaten." They asked questions about strangers, about Sarah's friends. She hesitated, then added, "They have papers, say they search for fugitives. Dangerous criminals." "More of Blackwood's lies," Charlotte said bitterly. "There's something else," Naya continued. "Heard men talking, Judge himself arriving tomorrow with Maine. These men just advance party." The news landed heavily between them. Blackwood was closing in, systematically eliminating their escape routes, drawing his net tighter around them. "We can't stay here," Elijah said, rising to check their surroundings through the gathering darkness. "If they've found Porter, they'll have patrols searching these woods by morning. Where can we go?" Charlotte asked, practical despite her exhaustion. "The border must be at least 2 days' journey on foot in this terrain." Naya was silent for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Then she spoke with quiet certainty. "I know place. Old trading post, abandoned many seasons. 1 day west, near river crossing. No one uses now. Bad spirits, white men say." "Bad spirits?" Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Fever killed many there 15 summers ago. White trappers, native traders. Place empty since," Naya shrugged. "No bad spirits really, just bad memories. But memories keep people away. Is it defensible?" Elijah asked, the soldier in him evaluating tactical possibilities. "Stone walls still stand. 1 door, 2 windows. Good sight lines to river." Naya nodded confidently. "Can see anyone approach." Charlotte understood the shift in their situation. They were no longer merely fleeing. They were preparing to make a stand. The realization should have terrified her, but instead, a strange calm settled over her spirit. Whatever came, they would face it together. They traveled through the night, guided by Naya's uncanny ability to navigate even in darkness. The rain eventually ceased, but the forest remained saturated, every brush against foliage sending cascades of droplets onto already damp clothing. Charlotte moved mechanically, 1 foot before the other, drawing strength from Elijah's occasional touch at her elbow or the small of her back, reassurance without words. Dawn broke with unexpected clarity, the storm clouds having moved eastward to reveal a sky washed clean. The first golden light filtered through the trees as Naya led them up a gentle rise. At its crest, she paused, pointing to a clearing below where a structure of weathered stone stood sentinel beside a wide, shallow river. Trading post, she announced. River crossing there leads to Oregon territory. Charlotte felt her breath catch at the sight of their destination, so tantalizingly close. Beyond that river lay the border, legal safety of a sort, and perhaps the beginning of a new life. They approached cautiously, Naya scouting ahead to ensure the abandoned post was truly empty. The building was smaller than Charlotte had envisioned, a single room with walls of stacked stone and a partially collapsed roof of rotted timber. Moss grew on the northern wall and vines had begun to reclaim the structure, twining through empty window frames. Not much, Elijah observed, surveying their refuge critically, but better than open ground. Inside, evidence of the trading post's hasty abandonment remained, shelves still affixed to walls, a heavy wooden counter, rusted metal implements scattered across dirt floors. Charlotte moved to clear space near the single intact window, brushing away years of accumulated debris. "We'll need water," she said practically, "and perhaps we could salvage some of these timbers to reinforce the door." Elijah glanced at her with something like pride. "You'd have made a fine soldier." Charlotte hazed. "I prefer to think I make a fine survivor," she replied with the hint of a smile. "Now shall we prepare while we can?" They worked through the morning, transforming the derelict trading post into something resembling a defensible position. Elijah's military experience guided their efforts, creating fields of fire, clearing sidelines, establishing fallback positions if the outer walls were breached. Charlotte marveled at the efficiency of their team, communication often reduced to gestures or single word, understanding flowing between them like a current. By midday, they had done all they could. Naya departed briefly to set warning signals along the approach path, arrangements of stones and sticks that would alert them to disturbance by anyone unfamiliar with their meaning. When she returned, they shared a meager meal of their remaining provisions. "What happens now?" Charlotte asked as they sat in the filtered sunlight streaming through the damaged roof. "We wait," Elijah replied simply, "and hope Blackwood makes a mistake." Naya rose to take first watch, positioning herself where she could observe the river crossing and both approaches to the trading post. Left alone in relative privacy, Charlotte moved closer to Elijah, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I never thought my life would lead here," she mused, watching dust motes dance in the sunbeams. From Boston drawing rooms to an abandoned trading post in the wilderness, waiting for a confrontation that might ... single quotes, she couldn't finish the thought. Elijah took her hand, his thumb tracing slow circles on her palm. "Regrets?" he asked quietly. "No," she answered without hesitation. "Fear, yes. Uncertainty, certainly, but not regret." She turned to face him fully. "Whatever happens, Elisha, know that you gave me something precious, the chance to choose my own path, even if it's dangerous. That's worth everything." He touched her cheek gently, then reached into his shirt pocket, withdrawing something small that glinted in the sunlight. "I've been carrying this since we left the ranch," he explained, opening his palm to reveal a simple gold ring. "It was my mother's." Charlotte's breath caught as he continued, voice rough with emotion. "I'm not asking for promises now, not with everything uncertain, but if we make it through this, when we make it through this, I want you to have it, not as a claim or ownership, but as a symbol of choice. Your choice." Tears welled in her eyes as she closed his fingers around the ring. "Keep it safe for now," she whispered. "Give it to me when we stand together on Oregon soil." Their kiss was gentle yet profound, a covenant between equals, a promise of possibility. When they parted, something had shifted between them, a deeper connection forged in the crucible of shared danger and mutual respect. The afternoon stretched into evening, tension building with each passing hour. Charlotte dozed fitfully against Elijah's shoulder, exhaustion finally claiming her despite her determination to remain alert. She woke to Naya's soft warning, a low whistle that brought them both instantly to attention. "Riders," the young woman reported, gesturing toward the eastern approach. 6 men, Blackwood leads them. They moved to their designated positions, Charlotte at the rear window with the spare revolver, Elijah near the reinforced door with his rifle, Naya on the partial second level where rotted floorboards still offered precarious perches and clear lines of sight through a gap in the stone wall. Charlotte watched the riders approach. Judge Blackwood, unmistakable in his formal black coat despite the frontier setting. His face was set in lines of grim determination, his posture radiating the absolute certainty of a man accustomed to having his will obeyed without question. Charlotte Hayes. His voice carried clearly across the clearing as the riders halted beyond rifle range. "I know you're in there. Surrender now, and no one needs to be harmed." No one answered. Blackwood waited, then continued with cold precision. "You've led me on quite a chase, Miss Hayes. Impressive for a woman of your background. But it ends here," he gestured to the men flanked. "These soldiers have orders to bring you in, dead or alive. Your accomplices as well." Still silence from the trading post. Blackwood's expression hardened. "Think carefully, Miss Hayes. Is this worth dying for? Your contract is legal and binding. Return to your rightful position, and I might be persuaded to show leniency to your ... single quotes, his mouth curved in a sneer. "Protector." Charlotte looked to Elijah, who gave a slight nod. She moved to the window, staying carefully to one side as she called back. "The contract no longer exists, Judge Blackwood. It was burned to ash, just as your power over me has been. Rage flashed across Blackwood's features, visible even at this distance. Then you've sealed your fate, he snarled. And for what? Some misguided principle? The affections of a Confederate deserter? For freedom, she replied simply. Something you wouldn't understand. Blackwood turned to the men with him, issuing sharp command. 3 riders circled left, 2 right, preparing to approach from multiple angles. Blackwood himself remained centered, watching the trading post with calculating eyes. Inside, Elijah moved swiftly between positions, checking sight lines and cover. Remember, he said quietly, wait for clear shots. Make each one count. What followed was a blur of noise and movement, the thunder of approaching hooves, the crack of rifles, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the small space. Charlotte fired deliberately as Elijah had taught her, not aiming to kill but to deter, forcing riders to retreat or dismount. Time lost meaning, stretched and compressed by the intensity of the moment. Charlotte was vaguely aware of Naya's precise shots from above, of Elijah's steady presence as he moved between firing positions. Once, a bullet splintered the wood beside her head, showering her with fragments. Another time, she heard Elijah grunt in pain but continue firing without pause. Then, abruptly, a new sound cut through the chaos, hoofbeats from the west, numerous and fast approaching. Through her window, Charlotte glimpsed riders emerging from the tree line across the river, at least a dozen men, several wearing the distinctive hats of the U.S. Marshal Service. Federal Marshal, voice bellowed across the clearing. Cease fire immediately. The sudden intervention created momentary confusion. Blackwood's men hesitated, weapons still raised but no longer firing. In that critical pause, the marshal who had spoken urged his horse forward, a document held high. Judge Augustus Blackwood, he called formally. I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of corruption, abuse of authority, and multiple counts of false imprisonment. Surrender your weapons and dismount. Charlotte could hardly believe what she was hearing. Beside her, Elijah moved to the window, his expression as stunned as her own. Sarah, he breathed in realization. She must have sent word to the federal authorities. Outside, Blackwood's face contorted with fury and disbelief. For one terrible moment, Charlotte thought he might order his men to fight. Instead, cold calculation returned to his features as he assessed the overwhelming odds. With deliberate slowness, he unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the ground. As federal marshals surrounded Blackwood and his men, Charlotte felt the tension drain from her body, leaving her trembling with reaction. Elijah's arm encircled her waist, supporting her as her knees threatened to buckle. It's over, he murmured against her hair. It's really over. 3 days later, Charlotte stood hand in hand with Elijah at the edge of a small frontier town just inside Indentured. Behind them lay the wilderness they had traversed, the dangers they had faced together. Before them, streets bustling with the promise of new beginnings. Ready? Elijah asked, the simple gold ring now gleaming on Charlotte's left hand. She nodded, squeezing his fingers as they stepped forward. At the sheriff's office across the dusty main street, deputies were taking down old wanted posters and replacing them with new ones. Blackwood's stern face now among those sought by the law rather than representing it. Where do we start? Charlotte wondered aloud as they walked toward the heart of town, the future unfolding before them like an open book waiting to be written. Elijah smiled, the lines of worry that had marked his face throughout their journey softening at last. Anywhere you choose, he said simply. That's what freedom means.